Alright, so now that we've seen how to pass values into a method, we're going to take a look at how to return a value from a method. So with value returning methods, there are going to be two changes to the method definition. The first, that's very easy to notice, is when we're dealing with the method header. You'll see that we're no longer using the void keyword. Instead, we're going to change it to whatever the data type happens to be. So in this particular case now, the return type is going to be int, because we're expecting this to return an int value. Additionally, there's going to be a return statement. So if we actually look inside the body of this method, you'll see at the very end of it, we've got the return keyword indicates our return statement. So we're going to say return whatever result happens to be. Since the return type is int, then the variable being returned, in this case result, must be of type int. So if you see a return statement and you already know what the return type is, that it should immediately tell you what the data type of the variable that you're returning happens to be. And if you were to look elsewhere in the body of this method, say at the very beginning of it, you'll see the very first part where we declare that variable int result. And so that indicates that, in fact, the data type of result is an int. So what we could go ahead and do is actually create this method as well. So let's go ahead and put this together. So we'll come back over to our setup that we have right here. We'll go ahead and close the Java doc window for now. And let's close the output window as well so we can free up some space. So let's say that in addition to this display sum, we'll go ahead and add that calc sum method as well, so that now instead of printing the sum to the console, we're going to go ahead and return that sum from that method to whatever is calling it. So we'll go ahead and say public static, and then we'll go ahead and include int for the return type. So we're not going to use void anymore. We're going to use int because that's what we want to return from this. So calc sum, and then the parameters in this case will still be pretty much the same as what we did for display sum. We could even go ahead and use the same names because of the fact that these are different scopes, so they're completely independent from one another. So we'll go ahead and say something like int num1, and let's say int num2. So we'll start off with just two int variables. And so then we'll go ahead and declare result. So we've got int result. Let's say we initialize it to 0 as well. We'll then go ahead and assign to result the value num1 plus num2. So whatever their sum happens to be, we'll go ahead and put that into result, and then we'll also go ahead and return result. So now that we've got this method that is capable of returning a value, what exactly can we do with that value? So if we come back over here, so the return statement is going to send a value, or in some cases a reference, back to the caller. So that is to say the method that is calling this method that we want to use. That value can then be assigned to a variable or used for some other kind of processing. So if we go ahead and test this out, we see right here we've got our calcsum method. We've also got the main method with a call to calcsum. And you'll see that in this same line where we are calling calcsum, we're passing in two values, 10 and 5. We are taking that method call and we are assigning it to this sum variable. And so what that's doing is that's saying, okay, once I'm done with this method, I return a value from it. I want to take that value that I'm returning from that method, and I want to assign that value to this variable. So if we go ahead and minimize this, we can come over to the main method. We'll make use out of this calcsum up here. So let's say we do it right after this one. So let's go ahead and create some integer. We'll call it sum inside of the main method. Say this is going to be equal to our calcsum, and then we'll go ahead and give it some values like, say, that 10 and 5 that we just saw. So what's going to happen is we'll take this 10 and 5, we'll pass these into the method. So 10 is going to be used for num1, 5 is going to be used for num2. It's pretty much exactly like display sum. So we come back down to calcsum. So num1 has the value 10 in it, and then num2 has the value 5 in it. We'll go ahead and declare and initialize our result. We'll go ahead and add num1 and num2 together, so they currently hold the values 10 and 5. Add those together and get the value 15. We'll assign that to result, and then we'll go ahead and return result. So then we're going to take that 15 that we have, we'll take that back up to where it was called, so that was right here. And so effectively what we're doing is we're replacing this method call with the value that we ultimately get when we return it from that method. And so that value is what we're going to assign to sum. So the end result of all of this is that the value 15 is going to be assigned to the variable sum. And then if we want to, we can go ahead and print this to the console. So we'll say system.out.println, and we'll go ahead and put sum right there. Save this. And so now if we go ahead and run this, the very last thing that we should expect to see printing to the console is just the number 15. So we go ahead and run this, and we can see that in this very last line right here, we get that value 15. And so then if I go ahead and change these values, say maybe I try something like, let's say 15 for this first one and then 7 for the second one. So now 15 is going to be used for num1, 7 is going to be used for num2. We've seen a little bit with the method definition, so at this point we kind of understand what's going to happen. We're going to again create or declare a variable called result, initialize it to 0. We'll sum up 15 and 7, our num1 and num2, get 22, assign that to result, and then go ahead and return that. And so then, given 15 and 7, this method call will eventually be replaced with that value 22 that we're returning from it, and we'll go ahead and assign that value to sum. So then, if we go ahead and save this and run it again, now we're going to get the value 22 printing to the console. Okay. And so in addition to this, including the fact that we can go ahead and assign it to a variable, we can also use it for other types of processing. For example, we could just use it directly in our print statement. So if we wanted to, we could just go ahead and not worry about declaring this variable sum. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab that method call. Go ahead and remove the rest of this line. And then we'll get rid of the sum that we don't need anymore. And I'll just go ahead and paste that method call right there. And so what this is going to do is it will essentially perform the same set of tasks. It will call the calcsum method, passing in the values 15 and 7. It'll sum them together, giving you that value of 22, and then returning that from the calcsum method. And then it'll go ahead and, because I put it inside of this print statement, just immediately take that value and print that to the console. So the end result of this would be exactly the same. We run it and we see that we still get 22 printing to the console. The difference is that now I'm not going through that extra step of storing that into some other variable. So now that we've seen a little bit about actually creating one of these value returning methods, we can also introduce another annotation tag for our documentation comments, and that's going to be the return tag. So we're going to use essentially just like @param. This one's going to be @return. And this is going to be used to specify what that method will return. So if we wanted to, we can go ahead and add that to our calcsum method. So we'll come down here. Again, because we're working in the text editor for NetBeans, if I go ahead and just start the first couple of characters for my documentation comments, so it's going to be that /*, I push enter, it'll immediately fill the rest of this with all of the necessary information. So the very first thing is going to be a description of this. So in this particular case, the description is not terribly different from what we had for display sum. So we can go ahead and say the calcsum method is used to calculate the sum of two numbers. So not necessarily going to be used to display that sum. We might use it for some other kind of processing. At the very least, it is at least intended to calculate the sum of these two numbers. The two parameters, num1 and num2, are still going to be exactly the same as they were for display sum. So this one's just going to be the first operand of your addition. This one's going to be the second operand of your addition. And then the thing that we're going to return is going to be a result of the addition. Go ahead and save that. And then if we go ahead and open up that Java doc again, so we'll come over to Window, go to IDE Tools, come over to our Java doc documentation, we'll open that up. And so now, as long as we've got our cursor inside of this documentation comment, we can go ahead and see all of that right here. So we still see most of the same sort of information as we did for our previous look at this Java doc information. We still have the location with the package and class. We've got the header, so you see public static int, calcsum, int num1 and int num2 for the parameters. We've got the calcsum method is used to calculate the sum of two numbers, so we see that general description of it. We've got a section for the parameters, num1 and num2. Looks identical to what we did for display sum. And now with the addition of this return annotation, we've got another section right here at the bottom with returns, and then just a brief description of what it is that this method is meant to return. And this becomes especially important when you're dealing with methods where the intended behavior of the method, perhaps even the name of the method, doesn't necessarily tell you precisely what it's going to return. A pretty good example of that might be the Compareto methods that we've seen for our string class. So at first glance, if you just see the name Compareto and you see the fact that you're doing it with two strings, it might not necessarily be very obvious what it is that that method is going to do or what it's going to return. So including a little description like this, specifying that it's actually going to return an integer value with the difference based on the ASCII characters of those two strings, would be very useful. So there's certainly some merit to including this documentation for your methods. Alright, so in addition to numeric values, methods can also be used to return booleans or chars. So we'll go ahead and take a look at an example here where we're returning a boolean. The following method is going to be used to determine if a number is even or odd by checking the remainder whenever we divide by the number 2. So what that's going to do is we're going to use the modulo operator. So this will be a good opportunity to make use out of that particular operator, where we're going to essentially divide the number by 2. And if that number has a remainder of 0, that would indicate that it's even, whereas if it has a remainder of 1, that indicates that it's odd. So we'll go ahead and create this method. We're calling it isEven. It's going to be public static boolean. So because we're returning either a true or false value, the return type is going to be boolean. We're going to give it a number. In this case, we're going to deal with strictly integers. And then inside the body of the isEven method, we'll go ahead and create a Boolean variable called status that will initially be false. We'll then go ahead and include a little check right here. We're going to say if the number mod 2 is equal to 0, we'll go ahead and change status to true, and then at the very end we'll go ahead and return status. So essentially the way this works is if we give it an even number, say like 10 for example, when we get to this check, we'll see that that check is true, so that's going to change the value of status from false to true, and then it'll go ahead and return true. Whereas if we give it an odd number, say like 9, in that case, when we get to this condition, we'll see that it's false, so we skip the line where we change status to true, and then we're going to go ahead and return status as false. So we'll go ahead and minimize this. We'll come over here. Let's go ahead and we'll remove these for now. So we'll come down to the bottom of this, and we'll go ahead and add yet another method to this. So we'll go ahead and do public static. In this case, it's going to be Boolean for the return type. We'll say isEven, and then we'll say int number. So the parameter for this one, it's going to be expecting an integer value. We'll go ahead and create that Boolean called status. So this is equal to false initially. We'll then go ahead and say if number mod 2 is equal to 0, so we're using the equals operator. We'll go ahead and take our status and change that to true. And then finally, we'll go ahead and return the status. We'll go ahead and save that. And so now what we can go ahead and do, if we come up to the main method, let's say right here, because this is returning a value, either true or false in this case, we can go ahead and do the same thing we did with calcsum, where we can actually put that method inside of a print statement, and it will just immediately go ahead and print out whatever value it returns from it. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll do system.out.println, and right here we're going to do isEven, and let's go ahead and put in, to start off with, let's say an even number. Let's try like the number 20, for example. We'll go ahead and save that. And so if we go ahead and run this, we'll see that we get true at the very end right here. And then if we go ahead and modify this to do an odd number, let's say 17, for example, we run this again, and we'll see that we get false. Okay. So now that we've seen a little bit of that method to start off with, I want to go ahead and use this as an opportunity to discuss a few techniques that we can use for reducing the amount of code needed in a method. And in a general sense, we could also say that this helps to reduce the amount of code we need in most practical situations, not necessarily just our method definitions. But to start off with, we'll go ahead and remove that status flag and have this this method return either a true or false literal instead. So we'll go ahead and essentially just remove or shave off a single line of code by doing this. So let's go ahead and take care of that. So we'll go ahead and minimize this. We'll come over here. Let's go ahead and close the output window for a moment. So we'll come down here. We'll go ahead and get rid of this. And so right here, what we can go ahead and do is just say, instead of status equals, we'll just go ahead and create a return statement. We'll say return true. And for this one, we'll go ahead and say return false. So there's a couple of things to note about how this is going to work. To start off with, we can have multiple return statements inside of our method. One of the important things to keep in mind, though, is that you cannot create this in such a way that sometimes you would execute a return statement and sometimes you wouldn't. What I mean to say by that is that if we don't include this return false, we remove that, then it's going to give us an error because sometimes we don't return true. And in those cases, we didn't specify anything else to return. So it thinks that in some scenarios, we don't return anything at all, which is not how this method is able to work. It's always expecting a Boolean to be returned from it. So that's the error that we're going to see here. It's going to say missing return statement, simply implying that in some cases, we will be missing a return statement. So if you have multiple return statements like this, you just have to make sure that at least one of them is going to be chosen every time that you go through this program. So in this case, if return true, if we don't do this, then we're always going to go ahead and do this instead. The second thing to note is that return statements are a little bit unique in how they behave in a method, in that they will essentially stop the call to that method as soon as you hit them. So as soon as we see this return true statement right here, this is essentially going to mark the end of our call to this method. We're going to go ahead and return true and then basically terminate this method. So anytime that we encounter this line of code, we're not going to keep going through the rest of it, so we're never going to see this line of code right here. And to give you an example of what I mean by that, go ahead and include a print statement just before this. For this one, we'll go ahead and just let this say the word test, just to be able to demonstrate whether or not we hit this line of code or not. And so if we come back up to the top here, so right now we are using 17 as our example here. So if I go ahead and run this, we'll see that we get the word test to print out and then false for the return value of is even. So that makes sense if we look at the method again. So we see that this return false comes after the print statement. So in order to reach this line, we have to pass through this line, meaning that this will have to execute, and we'll go ahead and print out the word test to the console. However, if we go ahead and make this true, so we make this an even value, go ahead and save it. So now if we go ahead and run it, we see that we get the value true, but we never get the value test to print to the console. And the reason for that is that as soon as we reach this line right here, this is going to be the end of the program, so we never see anything that comes after it. So we don't see this print statement or this return false. Okay. So then the remainder of this kind of goes through what I just mentioned. You'll notice that the second return statement is not placed inside of an else block. You might assume that this statement will always execute, but because of how the return statement works, that always terminates the method being called. So if the line to return true is executed, then the line to return false is never going to be reached, as I just demonstrated. But we can actually make this code even shorter than this. So to further simplify this code, we can actually just return the Boolean expression that we are checking. So we can go ahead and just say return number mod 2 equals 0, because of the fact that that Boolean expression will evaluate to either true or false. So that much is already good enough for our return statement. So if I go ahead and minimize this again, we'll come back over here. So let's go ahead and just get rid of everything that we have right now and say that we just want to return our number mod2 equals 0. And because of the fact that this entire thing that we have right here is a Boolean expression, this will evaluate to either true or false. After it's done doing all of its evaluation so that it gives either a true or false value, then we'll go ahead and return that value. So then we'll go ahead and use this return keyword to just figure out what it evaluated to. So if we go ahead and run this, we'll see that we still get true since we're using that value of 20 in this method right now. And so then if we come over here and we change this again to say 17, we save that and we run it, then we'll go ahead and get the value false. So at this point now it's just going to directly do the comparison and then immediately return the result of that comparison without any additional lines of code for that. And then finally, with objects of classes such as string, the return statement is going to return the reference to that object. So in this particular case, we've got a string called customer name. It's equal to this method full name with two strings passed in, John and Martin. So because we're passing in strings, keep in mind that these are also passed by reference. So that means that first and last, these will hold a reference to those objects. String name is going to be initially empty. We'll then go ahead and create a name which is equal to just the first and last name with a space in between them, and then we'll go ahead and return that name. So one of the things to note, while I can go ahead and demonstrate this, again, as I've noted with strings, it's not really meaningful to talk too much about passing by reference. For the most part, there's not really any cases where this is going to matter a whole lot or be very meaningful. This will become more relevant whenever we start talking about creating our own custom objects and using those. But at the very least, to go ahead and put this together just so we can see the end result of it. We'll come over to NetBeans. So we'll come down here to the very bottom. We'll go ahead and create this final method. So we're going to say public static. And for this one, the return type is going to be string. Again, just like any other case where you're using a class, remember that the class name, in this case string, always uses Pascal case, so it's going to have a capital S. So say public static string full name, and then we'll have a string first name and another string for last name. And then we'll just go ahead and say that we want to create this string. So we're going to go ahead and call this, let's say, F name, the F being short for full name. So this is equal to an empty string initially. And then right here, we'll go ahead and say that our F name is equal to our first name plus a space plus our last name. And then we'll just go ahead and return that F name. And then if we go ahead and come back up to the main method, so let's say right here, go ahead and create a string. We can call this something like that customer name that we had. And this will be equal to that full name method. And we'll go ahead and give it John and Smith. And then if we go ahead and just print this out just so we can see the results of it, we can save that and we will run it. And then we can go ahead and see John Smith with the full name that we just generated by just taking the first and last name and just kind of combining them together. We can see that printing to the console. Alright, so at this point, this will wrap up everything for returning a value from a method. So at this point, we've essentially covered everything that needs to be said conceptually about methods. So we've seen kind of an introduction to methods. We've seen how to pass arguments into them or how to use the parameter variables of a method. And we've seen how to return values from them and make use out of the different kinds of return types. So for the next couple of videos going through this chapter, what I'm going to go ahead and do now is kind of shift from doing this more conceptual and kind of abstract or arbitrary explanation of all the different concepts. I'm going to move away from that now and switch to actually going through a couple of different examples where we're going to make use out of a few methods to try to solve a few different types of problems. So we'll take a look at that as we go through the next 3 videos. We'll go through 3 different problems.